Bald Hills. Prince Nicholas Bolkonski's estate lay 40 miles east from Smolensk and 2 miles from the main road to Moscow. The same evening that the prince gave his instructions to Alpatych, Dessalles, having asked to see Princess Mary, told her that, as the prince was not very well and was taking no steps to secure his safety, though from Prince Andrew's letter it was evident that to remain at Bald Hills might be dangerous, he respectfully advised her to send the letter by Alpatych to the provincial governor at Smolensk, asking him to let her know the state of affairs and the extent of the danger to which Bald Hills was exposed. Dessalles wrote this letter to the governor for Princess Mary. She signed it, and it was given to Alpatych with instructions to hand it to the governor and to come back as quickly as possible if there was danger. Having received all his orders, Alpatych, wearing a white beaver hat, a present from the prince, and carrying a stick as the prince did, went out accompanied by his family. 3 well-fed roans stood ready harnessed to a small conveyance with a leather hood. The larger bell was muffled and the little bells on the harness stuffed with paper. The prince allowed no one at Bald Hills to drive with ringing bells, but on a long journey Alpatych liked to have them. His satellites, the senior clerk, a counting-house clerk, a scullery maid, a cook, 2 old women, a little page boy, the coachman, and various domestic serfs were seeing him off. His daughter placed chintz-covered down cushions for him to sit on and behind his back. His old sister-in-law popped in a small bundle, and one of the coachmen helped him into the vehicle. There. Women's fuss. Women, said Alpatych, puffing and speaking rapidly just as the prince did, and he climbed into the trap. After giving the clerk orders about the work to be done, Alpatych, not trying to imitate the prince now, lifted the hat from his bald head and crossed himself 3 times. If there is anything... Come back, Yakov Alpatych. For Christ's sake, think of us, cried his wife, referring to the rumors of war and the enemy. Women's fuss, muttered Alpatych to himself and started on his journey, looking round at the fields of yellow rye and the still green, thickly growing oats, and at other quite black fields just being ploughed a second time. As he went along he looked with pleasure at the year's splendid crop of corn, scrutinized the strips of rye field which here and there were already being reaped, made his calculations as to the sowing and the harvest, and asked himself whether he had not forgotten any of the prince's orders. Having baited the horses twice on the way, he arrived at the town toward evening on the 4th of August. Alpatych kept meeting and overtaking baggage trains and troops on the road. As he approached Smolensk he heard the sounds of distant firing, but these did not impress him. What struck him most was the sight of a splendid field of oats in which a camp had been pitched and which was being mown down by the soldiers, evidently for fodder. This fact impressed Alpatych, but in thinking about his own business he soon forgot it. All the interests of his life for more than 30 years had been bounded by the will of the prince, and he never went beyond that limit. Everything not connected with the execution of the prince's orders did not interest and did not even exist for Alpatych. On reaching Smolensk on the evening of the 4th of August he put up in the Gachina suburb across the Dnieper, at the inn kept by Ferepontov, where he had been in the habit of putting up for the last 30 years. Some 30 years ago Ferepontov, by Alpatych's advice, had bought a wood from the prince, had begun to trade, and now had a house, an inn, and a corn dealer's shop in that province. He was a stout, dark, red-faced peasant in the 40s, with thick lips, a broad knob of a nose, similar knobs over his black frowning brows, and a round belly. Wearing a waistcoat over his cotton shirt, Ferepontov was standing before his shop which opened onto the street. On seeing Alpatych he went up to him. "You're welcome, Yakov Alpatych. Folks are leaving the town, but you have come to it," said he. "Why are they leaving the town?" asked Alpatych. "That's what I say. Folks are foolish. Always afraid of the French." Single quote. Women's fuss, said Alpatych. "Just what I think, Yakov Alpatych. What I say is, orders have been given not to let them in, so that must be right." and the peasants are asking 3 rubles for carting it isn't Christian. Single quote. Yakov Alpatych heard without heeding. He asked for a samovar and for hay for his horses, and when he had had his tea he went to bed. All night long troops were moving past the inn. Next morning Alpatych donned a jacket he wore only in town and went out on business. It was a sunny morning and by 8 o'clock it was already hot. A good day for harvesting, thought Alpatych. From beyond the town firing had been heard since early morning. At 8 o'clock the booming of cannon was added to the sound of musketry. Many people were hurrying through the streets and there were many soldiers, but cabs were still driving about. Tradesmen stood at their shops, and service was being held in the churches as usual. Alpatych went to the shops, to government offices, to the post office, and to the governor's. In the offices and shops and at the post office everyone was talking about the army and about the enemy who was already attacking the town. Everybody was asking what should be done, and all were trying to calm one another. In front of the governor's house Alpatych found a large number of people, Cossacks, and a travelling carriage of the governor's. At the porch he met 2 of the landed gentry, one of whom he knew. This man, an ex-captain of police, was saying angrily, "It's no joke, you know. It's all very well if you're single. One man though undone is but one, as the proverb says, but with 13 in your family and all the property. ... They've brought us to utter ruin. What sort of governors are they to do that? They ought to be hanged, the brigands. ... Single quote. Oh come, that's enough," said the other. "What do I care? Let him hear. We're not dogs," said the ex-captain of police, and looking round he noticed Alpatych. "Oh, Yakov Alpatych, what have you come for?" Single quote. "To see the governor by his excellency's order," answered Alpatych, lifting his head and proudly thrusting his hand into the bosom of his coat as he always did when he mentioned the prince. ... He has ordered me to inquire into the position of affairs," he added. "Yes, go and find out," shouted the angry gentleman. "They've brought things to such a pass that there are no carts or anything. ... There it is again, do you hear?" said he, pointing in the direction whence came the sounds of firing. "They've brought us all to ruin. ... The brigands," he repeated, and descended the porch steps. Alpatych swayed his head and went upstairs. In the waiting room were tradesmen, women, and officials, looking silently at one another. The door of the governor's room opened and they all rose and moved forward. An official ran out, said some words to a merchant, called a stout official with a cross hanging on his neck to follow him, and vanished again, evidently wishing to avoid the inquiring looks and questions addressed to him. Alpatych moved forward, and next time the official came out addressed to him, one hand placed in the breast of his buttoned coat, and handed him 2 letters. "To His Honor Baron Ash, from General-in-Chief Prince Bolkonski," he announced with such solemnity and significance that the official turned to him and took the letters. A few minutes later the governor received Alpatych and hurriedly said to him, "Inform the prince and princess that I knew nothing. I acted on the highest instructions here." And he handed a paper to Alpatych. "Still, as the prince is unwell, my advice is that they should go to Moscow. I am just starting myself. Inform them." Single quote. But the governor did not finish. A dusty, perspiring officer ran into the room and began to say something in French. The governor's face expressed terror. "Go," he said, nodding his head to Alpatych, and began questioning the officer. Eager, frightened, helpless glances were turned on Alpatych when he came out of the governor's room. Involuntarily listening now to the firing, which had drawn nearer and was increasing in strength, Alpatych hurried to his inn. The paper handed to him by the governor said this: "I assure you that the town of Smolensk is not in the slightest danger as yet, and it is unlikely that it will be threatened with any. I from the one side and Prince Bagration from the other are marching to unite our forces before Smolensk, which junction will be effected on the 22nd instant. And both armies with their united forces will defend our compatriots of the province entrusted to your care till our efforts shall have beaten back the enemies of our fatherland." or till the last warrior in our valiant ranks has perished. From this you will see that you have a perfect right to reassure the inhabitants of Smolensk, for those defended by two such brave armies may feel assured of victory. Opening parenthesis. Instructions from Barclay de Tolly to Baron Ash, the civil governor of Smolensk, 1812. Closing parenthesis. People were anxiously roaming about the streets. Carts piled high with household utensils, chairs, and cupboards kept emerging from the gates of the yards and moving along the streets. Loaded carts stood at the house next to Ferepontov's, and women were wailing and lamenting as they said goodbye. A small watchdog ran round barking in front of the harnessed horses. Alpatych entered the inn at a quicker pace than usual and went straight to the shed where his horses and trap were. The coachman was asleep. He woke him up, told him to harness, and went into the passage. From the host's room came the sounds of a child crying, the despairing sobs of a woman, and the hoarse angry shouting of Ferepontov. The cook began running hither and thither in the passage like a frightened hen, just as Alpatych entered. "He's done her to death. Killed the mistress. ... Beat her. ... Dragged her about so. ... What for?" asked Alpatych. "She kept begging to go away. She's a woman. 'Take me away,' says she. 'Don't let me perish with my little children. Folks,' she says, 'are all gone, so why,' she says, 'don't we go?' And he began beating and pulling her about so." At these words Alpatych nodded as if in approval, and not wishing to hear more went to the door of the room opposite the innkeeper's, where he had left his purchases. "You brute! You murderer!" screamed a thin, pale woman who, with a baby in her arms and her kerchief torn from her head, burst through the door at that moment and down the steps into the yard. Ferepontov came out after her, but on seeing Alpatych adjusted his waistcoat, smoothed his hair, yawned, and followed Alpatych into the opposite room. "Going already?" said he. Alpatych, without answering or looking at his host, sorted his packages and asked how much he owed. "We'll reckon up." "Well, have you been to the governor's?" asked Ferepontov. "What has been decided?" Alpatych replied that the governor had not told him anything definite. "With our business, how can we get away?" said Ferepontov. "We'd have to pay 7 rubles.